I tell people I started studying Buddhism at the age of 25, and at the age of 45, I began to look like him. And so let's get started. We'll talk about the basics of Buddhism. Buddhism is the world's fourth largest religion with over 520 million followers, comprising 7% of the global population. So again, when we consider that Christianity is the largest, Islam is the second largest, Hinduism is the third largest, Buddhism comes in right in fourth place at 7% of the world's population. Buddhism is an Indian religion, very much alive today in different forms in India today. Although you won't hear much of the Buddha, you will often hear of the Buddha in one of his avatars or incarnations as Vishnu. So this faith, although it started in India, was subsumed into Hinduism, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Buddhism is a religion that encompasses a number of religions. It comes from Hinduism, but it took a separate path, and on this path is what we're going to discuss tonight. Buddhism originated in India between the 6th and the 4th centuries, spreading through much of Asia, and that's BCE. So just to give you some insight here, everything that we're going to talk about happened 500 to 600 years before Christianity, before Jesus walked the earth. All Buddhist traditions share the goal of overcoming suffering and the cycle of death and rebirth, as we talked about yesterday in Hinduism. There are some constants that run through all of these. So the idea of samsara, the idea of life and death and rebirth, these are all similar themes that are also present to us in Buddhism. Buddhists differ on their path to enlightenment, on their path to liberation, and that's what we'll discuss today. The Buddha, or the Enlightened One, was named Siddhartha Gautama. And much like St. Francis of Assisi, Siddhartha Gautama was born to a high class. He was born to the warrior caste. And he had a life of riches. He had everything that you could imagine. He wanted for nothing. Everything that you could imagine was lavished on him. And yet, he felt a lacking. He felt an emptiness. Nothing could satisfy him. He felt absolutely no connection to others, and he felt no connection to himself. He left home. There's often talk, this is the age that I use, but it would have been very comfortable to use the number 30, right? And as we've already discussed, why would it be comfortable and easy to use that number 30? Because this is the same number that Jesus was when he started his ministry, and many other men of faith were in this age between 30 and 40 when they started their ministry. He left home at the age of 29 to seek deeper meaning. And he did this, he left the comfort of his home and he went out into the forests and he went out to the populations where he was surrounded by poverty. And for the first time he saw poverty, misery, and illness. At home, he felt discontented with his materialistic life and all the conditions that surrounded him. And so in response to seeing this need, he gave up everything, all of his material possessions. One of the struggles that many people have with Buddhism is that in giving up all of his possessions, he also gave up his responsibilities. In very few texts that we'll read about Buddhism will we hear that not only did the Buddha give away his possessions, he gave away all of his clothes, he gave away all of his money and his home, he also gave up his wife and son. And this is something that causes a great deal of concern for people who look at the Buddha and say, how could you give up not just these things, the possessions, but how could you give up on the person that you pledged your life to? How could you give up on your son? And yet the Buddha explains that he said that in being attached, it creates a prison. And this attachment, this connectedness, would never allow him to achieve enlightenment. And it's part of this that is also the foundation today for many of our faiths that recommend, particularly the Catholic faith, that has recommended that all of their priests not be married, is the idea that when you're focused on the responsibility of a wife and children and family, that you can't adequately dedicate yourself to your calling, to your ministry, to your service. Whether you agree with that or not, there's a foundation in this giving up of all things to search and to accept your way. Siddhartha studied under the wisest religious teachers and philosophers of his time, and he learned all that he could, but he found that it wasn't enough. He traveled the path of self-mortification. He would often starve himself. He would punish himself. He wouldn't take care of himself, didn't bathe, didn't care for his body at all, thinking that through self-mortification he would find enlightenment. But even in self-mortification and asceticism, he couldn't find the life that he wanted. So we have on one hand this remarkable, wealthy life, and we have on the other hand this life of mortification, and neither one of them worked for him. And so what he vowed and what he determined was that he would take the middle way, the middle path. He would be neither self-denying, nor would he be self-indulgent. And at the age of the 35, I like this part because it also speaks to the middle way. Jesus started his ministry at the age of 30, and Muhammad started his ministry at the age of 40, and the Buddha took the middle way and started at the age of 35. On a full moon in the night of May, he sat beneath the branches of what is now known as the Bodhi tree, or a Bo tree, in a secluded grove by the banks of the river Nirvana, and he engaged in deep meditation. And for 40 days, he considered the hidden meanings of his mind, his life, and the universe. So for 40 days, and we can see this number again taking shape. And keep in mind now, as we make references to this, these 40 days were discussed 500 to 600 years before John the Baptist has his 40 days and before Jesus has his 40 days. It's this idea of being alone in meditation, considering all that is and all that will be, and this is the moment that he became the Buddha. This enlightenment is not a revelation from a divine being. There's no creator God in Buddhism. This is about oneness with the powers of the universe. This is about discovering the clearest experience of his life and his experience of the mind. After his experience of enlightenment, he no longer felt the effects of craving, anger, or delusion. Having reached the goal of enlightenment, the Buddha spent the next 45 years teaching the path of enlightenment. The path known as the Dharma, and remember in Hinduism, Dharma is literally called the path or the way. In Buddhism, Dharma takes on a little bit of a different meaning. It means the truth of all things, or the path underlying existence, the nature of one's existence. And so he wanted to help others understand the truth of our existence. And we'll talk about those truths briefly. The Buddha died in 483 BCE, and upon his death he passed into Nirvana, the ultimate release from suffering, in which salvation is achieved and no wanting and no desiring is desired. In the last breath, in his last words, he said some very simple words. He said, strive on with awareness. To be aware of himself, to be aware of yourselves, to be aware of your position and your place in all things, that this awareness is what brings us to enlightenment. After his death, Buddhism began to spread through small communities of monks and nuns that sprung up along the paths that the Buddha traveled when he was alive. The followers today are devoted to his teachings. They dress in yellow robes still today, and they wander the countryside to meditate quietly. For almost 200 years, however, these humble disciples were overshadowed by the dominant Hindu religion. So keep in mind that Buddha was born a Hindu and likely died a Hindu. In the same way that we talk about Jesus being born a Jew and dying a Jew, the first Buddhists came after the Buddha, although there's an interesting discussion because the Buddha himself, even while he was alive, recognized that he had lived in past lives and that he was not the first Buddha. So Siddhartha Gautama, the one that we consider the Buddha or the enlightened one, actually remembered past lives in which he had met other Buddhas, which would mean that he was not the first Buddha, but that the Buddha that he had met in his past lives had seen him and encouraged him and saw his future and spent time with him to encourage him in the ways of enlightenment. And so because of that Buddha that he had met in a past life, he was able to become the Buddha that we know today. It all gets a little bit jumbled, doesn't it? Yes. In the 3rd century BCE, several ambitious leaders built the expansive Mauryan Empire. One king, named Ashoka, was really troubled by what he saw with wartime. He was a leader himself, had sent out his armies to kill and to conquer, but he saw the results of war. He saw what happened to people when they were conquering and the people who had been conquered. So he converted to Buddhism and adopted a code of nonviolence and renounced all warfare and adopted Buddhist principles into his ruling. And so because of him, Buddhism spread. Let's think about another empire that spread a religion. If it wasn't for Constantine, Christianity today would not be Christianity as we know it. But because of one leader who at the right time recognized the message, felt that this was an important message, he adopted the message, and because of Constantine, Christianity spread like wildfire. But if it hadn't been for Constantine, Christianity probably would have died as a very small Jewish cult. But because of Constantine accepting it, and not only accepting and tolerating it, but making it the religion of the land, it spread. And in the same way here, we see Buddhism started out as an offshoot of Hinduism, started to gain popularity, but probably wouldn't have gone very far if it weren't for the support of Ashoka. With the spread of Buddhism, its traditional practices and philosophies became regionally distinct. So what the Buddha had said now began to spread around the countryside, and it began to be adopted by Hindus. And so they adopted Buddhism as another one of their faces. So today, many scholars believe that Buddhist practices didn't necessarily vanish, but they were absorbed into the tolerant Hindu faith. And as we can see today, the Buddha is actually considered in the incarnation of Siddhartha Gautama is actually considered an avatar or an incarnation of the god Vishnu of the Hindu faith. The Buddha warned strongly against accepting things at face value. He believed very clearly that if you were to find enlightenment, you must seek the truth. You must seek wisdom. And so if you find a teaching that does not resonate with you or that seems false, question it. That you shouldn't even consider his words to be the words of divine, because in the end, Buddha was not divine. Buddha was simply a messenger to help people to gain enlightenment. Interestingly, the Buddha also said that the traveler on his path to enlightenment should practice tolerance. And by tolerance, he didn't mean that we should accept everything that we hear or blindly accept the things that we're told along our way in wisdom. But it's to not get angry at what you can't accept. That in many relationships we find throughout our life that we disagree with someone, and our first tendency is to get angry. When you get angry, what you're really doing is you're allowing your ego to stand between you and the truth. Because anger allows us no longer to listen or to accept or to understand. This anger stands in the way. And so by practicing tolerance, we might come to find that later on, we might believe those things that in the past we once disagreed with. The Buddha said that there were 4 noble truths that we must follow, and that all of these focused on the reality of human suffering and the need to eliminate human suffering from our lives. The Buddha compared our search for unimportant information to the story of a man shot by a poison-tipped arrow who demanded to know first who shot the arrow, where was the arrow made, and of what was the arrow made, and by whom was the arrow made, and when and where was the arrow made, before calling the doctor. The foolish man died before his questions could be answered. In the same way, the Buddha believed that the urgent need for our existence is to find relief from suffering, which robs us of happiness and leaves us in strife. So, in other words, we're not often ready to answer the big questions in life until we've taken care of the basic needs. So when we can remove ourselves from suffering, when we can remove the pain from our lives, it's then that we're able to start focusing on enlightenment. But it's very difficult for a person who's attached, for a person who's hungry, or a person who is controlled by his appetites and his desires to seek enlightenment. That only a well-trained mind in meditation can clearly find the truth. So the 4 noble truths, and I'll put these in more simple terms, that all forms of being, human and otherwise, are afflicted with suffering. Simply, life is suffering. That's what he means. The cause of this suffering is desire, born of the illusion of the soul. We suffer because we don't understand life. That this suffering has a lasting end in the experience of enlightenment, which is the complete letting go of the illusion of the soul and all consequent desire and aversion. There is no soul. That this peaceful and blissful environment is achieved through a gradual training and a path called the middle way. That you must take the middle way to achieve enlightenment. Buddhism recognizes the truth of life's many sufferings and offers an end to suffering through the path to enlightenment in this life, not the next life. The middle way, or the Eightfold Path, means that you don't indulge, but it's also not self-mortification. We find moderate approaches. Only when the body is in reasonable comfort and not overindulged does the mind have the clarity and strength to meditate deeply and to discover the truth. The middle way consists of the diligent cultivation of virtue, meditation, and wisdom. And here are the Eightfold Paths. And you'll see here, there's 3 in wisdom: right understanding, right thought, and right speech. And then he gets, or 2 in right understanding and right thought. Then we have ethics, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And then the 3 under concentration: the right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. There are non-virtuous actions as well as virtuous actions. And they are split into 3 different areas. The non-virtuous actions are killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. In speech, it's lying, divisive speech, speech that divides people and causes them to think negatively about others, harsh speech, and idle gossip. And then there's non-virtuous actions of the mind. Just thinking is a non-virtuous action when you are craving, when you're involved in aversion, or when you're deluding yourself into thinking that you're more important than you are. Without virtue, it's impossible to perfect meditation. Without perfecting meditation, it's impossible to arrive at enlightenment, which is the purest form of wisdom. So it's the Noble Eightfold Path that leads to happiness and liberation. The law of karma implies that we cannot escape the results of our actions. This is the same as what we learned in Hinduism. There are deeds of body, speech, and mind that bring harm to others, to yourself, or to both. And these deeds are called bad karma because they're motivated by greed, hatred, or delusion. They bring painful results, and we should avoid them. And then there are deeds of body and speech and mind that bring well-being to yourself, to others, or to both of you. And such deeds are called good karma. And because they're generated by generosity, compassion, and wisdom, we should engage in these acts as much as possible. Much of what we experience in our life, says the Buddha, are the result of our thoughts and actions and the karma that they generate. This philosophy places all of the responsibility directly on our shoulders, and the same as in Hinduism, not on a God who is going to save us, but on ourselves, that we alone are responsible for our happiness, for our well-being, or for our hatred and our sadness. In simple terms, you reap what you sow. The Buddha states that no being whatsoever, divine or otherwise, has the power to stop bad karma. There's no God that's going to save you. There's no creator God, period, in the Buddhist concept. And so consequently, the fact that one reaps what one sows gives us a greater incentive to avoid all forms of bad karma while doing good karma as much as possible. Though one cannot escape the effects of bad karma, you can lessen the effects of bad karma. And he gives an example saying that a spoonful of salt mixed into a glass of water makes the water taste salty. But if you put that same spoonful of salt into a freshwater lake, you won't notice it at all. In the same way that if we conduct our lives creating gallons and gallons of kindness and good karma, 1 or 2 drops of salty bad karma are not going to spoil the mix. That in the end, it is an accumulation of one's deeds. And the Buddha recognized our human nature, our humanity, and that we're all going to make mistakes. But we shouldn't let that mistake, that singular mistake, or one of our weaknesses stop us from continuing to add good karma. And it's to focus on one's strengths, that each one of us has strengths in different areas. We can all contribute and give in very different areas and ways. And so we need to be able to recognize that we balance the good with the bad in our lives. This natural law of karma becomes the force, the reason, and the practice of morality and compassion in our society today. So this is the reason that we are kind and moral and compassionate to each other. It's that what comes around goes around. And also when we eliminate the idea of self and that we're all one, what we essentially recognize is that what I do to you, I do to me. And so why wouldn't I offer a hungry stranger something to eat? Because it's the same as offering myself something to eat. It's only when we engage ourselves in the idea of self that we accept our differences. And when we think that we're different, what I do to you is just to you. But if we recognize that we are all one, and that we all come from the same one, and we will all be the same one, what I do to you, I do to me. And that is the reason behind the practice of morality and compassion. Now this gets into a little bit of the doctrine, if you will, called merit transfer. So a person gains merit throughout one's life by doing good deeds. And interestingly, this is a very convenient afterthought in Buddhism. So now you have all these Buddhist monks walking around the countryside, right? And they don't have anything. So they're hungry. They need food. They need shelter. They need people to help take care of them. And so this idea of accumulating merit now comes in, that you can get and gain merit by giving things to Buddhist monks, right? So if in fact you give food to an itinerant monk, you receive merit to yourself. If you give water and you help care for that person, tend to his wounds, you gain merit for yourself. And in this way, this practice allows Buddhists to live their lives, to approach enlightenment, and yet it allows the layperson who cannot or chooses not to give up his life or her life to follow the path. It allows that person to gain merit by helping those on the journey. And it's really the idea behind sponsorship today in the churches, isn't it? That we recognize, perhaps all of us here who are working for a living or retired from working long careers, that we didn't choose the path to enlightenment, but we believe in helping those who can, whether it's helping a young musician, helping a young student who needs a scholarship, whatever that might be, that we all believe in some form or another in helping those, and that by helping others, we're doing a good thing and gaining merit to ourselves. While Buddhism considers the liberation from samsara the ultimate spiritual goal, most people practice this idea of gaining merit by doing good deeds and by helping those who are on the path to enlightenment, because they may recognize that in this life, right now, they're not ready for enlightenment. But by helping these other people on their path, in the future they may be ready, and this merit, these basically points, may help them. Rebirth. The Buddha remembered many of his past lives, and as I mentioned, he even remembered the Buddha in this past life who helped him on the way to becoming a Buddha. The law of karma is best understood in the framework of many lifetimes, and it helps understand the obvious inequities in life and in birth. But here is where Buddhism gets a little bit different from Hinduism. In Hinduism, it created the caste system, if you remember. The idea that if you lived your life a certain way, you would be penalized or rewarded in your next life based on how you lived. But in Buddhism, the effects of bad karma are not regarded as a punishment for evil deeds, but they're seen as lessons from which we can all learn. So when one is born among the poor, it teaches the need for generosity. When one is born with a disability, it teaches the need for compassion. And when one is abused, it teaches the need for kindness and mercy. And so consequently, when we see ourselves in these other people, we treat them with kindness and compassion because we recognize that this may have been us or it may be us. And so the mercy and the compassion that we show to these people is the mercy and the compassion that we show to ourselves. The Buddha pointed out that we live in different realms and that rebirth takes place in many different realms, both heavenly realms and earthly realms. There are three good realms: the heavenly realm, the demigod realm, and the human realm. And then there are three evil realms: the animal realms, the hungry ghost realms, and the hellish realms. Human beings can go from and into any one of these realms based on their actions. Understanding that we can come and go between these realms gives us more respect and compassion for the beings and the creatures in these realms. It's unlikely, he says, that you would exploit or hurt an animal if you understand that rebirth connects them with us. Much like we discussed about purgatory and also the idea of reincarnation, this waiting room between the lives in Hinduism, Buddhism also talks about this idea of a waiting room. And there's actually passages in the Pali Canon that lend support to the idea that the Buddha taught that there's a waiting room between this world and the next. There's also a lot of discussion, and the reason that these realms are so interesting, and I think that they were actually a later addition to the faith. And the reason they were a later addition to the faith was because people would ask, how is it that if one soul is reincarnating into the next one, or one person is reincarnating to the next, how is that possible when today there's 6 million more people than there was 2 years ago, or billions more people? And so they answer this with the idea that you can be in different realms. And so the animals, the hellish realm, and that there's all of these different realms. And so this waiting room period exists as well, that these souls may have been there, or these lights may have been there throughout time and are now being released. That's believed both by Hindus and by Buddhists. It gets into more details It's not really understood or practiced by most lay Buddhists. In Buddhism, there's no idea of a creator God, nor any priest or any intermediary to interfere with the working of anyone's karma. Buddhism teaches that the individual must take responsibility for his or her actions. And so consequently, if you want to be wealthy, you need to be trustworthy, right? You need to be diligent and frugal. These are all good things that lead in this life to being wealthy. And if you want to live in a heavenly realm, you should always be kind to others. In Buddhism, there's no God to ask for favors. Nothing interferes with the workings of karma. If you ask a Buddhist if they believe in a supreme being, and if the supreme being created the universe, a Buddhist may answer you, which universe? Because our universe is only one among millions of universes in their cosmology. And after one universe cycle ends, another one begins, according to an impersonal law. And that means that there isn't a personal God. There is no uncaused caused, as we think about the idea that there must be something, this idea of causation that started all of this. In Buddhism, that doesn't exist. The concept of an uncaused cause does not exist. A creator God is redundant in the scheme of Buddhism. No being is a savior, because no matter whether or not you're a god, an animal, or plant, or a mineral, everyone is subject to the law of karma. Even the Buddha does not possess the ability to save you. The Buddha only exists to help you on your way to enlightenment. He's just a guide for each of us to emulate. This is where Buddhism takes a dramatic path, different path from Hinduism. If you remember, in Hinduism, we talked about the idea of Brahman, which was this creator God, and then we have the idea of Atman, which is the idea that each one of us has a spark of Brahman inside of us. It's the personal soul. In Buddhism, there is no such thing as a personal soul. There is no essential and impermanent or permanent core to a living being. This is difficult for most of us to understand. How can there be reincarnation when there is no concept of a soul? In Buddhism, the living being is a temporary fusion of many parts, all living parts. It's a living being because all of these parts are present. And when any of these parts are gone, the being is no longer living. And so when asked how is this possible, the Buddha explains, when you have a candle and this candle is burning down low, you can light another candle from the dying candle. The flame from one candle goes out, and the flame from the new candle continues burning. What was past? There was nothing given. There was a transfer of energy. But there was nothing given. There was nothing taken. And in the same way, the idea of the soul in Buddhist philosophy is that there's nothing permanent, there's no soul that continues with us on our path. And this is why. Because the illusion of the soul, they believe, is the root cause of all human suffering. The illusion of soul manifests itself in the form of an ego, in a meanness. If I have a soul, I've just used the word I, which means that it's no longer we. We share oneness. We share a communion of being. And in the mind of a Buddhist, the idea of soul manifests itself in desire and aversion. It comes out in the form of ego. And an ego has attachment. It seeks satisfaction, but all that it experiences really is discontent. And so such suffering can't end until the idea of me and mine are seen as only an illusion. So the path to Nirvana. How do we get to Nirvana? There are a number of ways, but the goal really here is to give up the idea of self, to give up the idea, the illusion of soul. And the first stage is the stream enterer. So once you enter the stream of consciousness, it's unlike anything you've ever seen before. And it's one thing to read about this. It's quite another, I've heard, to experience it, because I am not there yet myself. A feeling of tremendous relief, a feeling of bliss or joy, comes over you, and you start to recognize that there is no such thing as self, and that any of your attachments to this world really are not significant. You lose sight of any of the things that you've desired in the path, in your past, and you feel a connection to all living things. The once returner, this is the second time around. So this is a constant, gradual path of becoming enlightened. This isn't something that happens overnight. It takes many, many years. Your mind becoming stronger, your concentration becoming more focused, and you'll have another direct insight into no self. Meaning, again, you're going to rediscover that there is no such thing as the self. And this insight brings even more detachment from illusion, detachment from any of your possessions, and attachment to this life. And then the never returner. You'll find that all the ideas of hatred and greed are really just felt as minor inconveniences, that there's very little that bothers you anymore. I think people tend to get this way as they get older too, don't we? I know my father is much less bothered by things in his life today than he was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. I would have loved to have seen that in my mother. I come from a family of 10 children. And so having 9 brothers and sisters, she was constantly worried about something. I would have really enjoyed seeing her get to the point where she just didn't care about some things. That would have been fantastic. We never got to see that. She passed away 10 years ago. But I do see it, and I appreciate it in my father. And I do also see in him this acceptance to impermanence. That as we get older, we give away our things, don't we? When we're in our younger years, we gather things to ourselves. We buy things. We surround ourselves with things because we're still involved with the idea of ego. We're involved in the ideas of possessions. And I can tell just by shopping with you people that you guys are not in that same boat. We can go to 15 or 20 stores and we'll walk out and only a handful of you will have purchased anything. But that's wonderful. It speaks to the idea that really what we have and what we treasure are experiences. And that's part of what Buddhism teaches us as well. The experience itself of Nirvana, or this never return stage, is rarely accompanied by any emotion or any excitement. There's nothing to get excited about. There's just a calm acceptance of what you've already seen and experienced and accepted before. And then you have Nirvana. And at this stage, this is where you feel that nothing else is important, nothing else is even a consideration. None of the circumstances of your life have even the slightest hold over you, whether it's positive or negative. Texts describe Nirvana as complete emptiness or nothingness. Nirvana actually means to be extinguished, or where no wind blows. And so they call Buddhism the ferry to the shores of Nirvana, where there are no pairs of opposites, there's no good or bad, there's no black or white, there's no love or hate. All of these things disappear. And so you no longer see the opposites. And so I'll quote from the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the apocryphal works. And for those of you who are interested in learning a little bit more of the apocryphal works, these are the books of Gospels that were never accepted into the traditional canon of the church Bible. And there's one verse from the Gospel of Thomas that says, "The kingdom of God is spread upon the earth, but we do not see it." So the message of Buddhism is simple and it's profound. And the idea is that we are to seek joyful participation in the suffering of this world. It's not that we're to escape it or that we're to challenge it, but we're to look at it in a different way. That life is suffering. To accept it as anything other than that creates discontentment and dissatisfaction. But when we recognize that life is indeed illusion and disillusion, and that it's discontentment and suffering, when we recognize this and see it for what it is, we can accept it and move on. And therein lies contentment. So you're in nirvana when you no longer wish for it. How do you become a Buddhist? I had someone actually ask me this the other day. How do I become a Buddhist? It's very easy. You just say, I'm a Buddhist. It's just that easy. There are 3 refuges. There's a ceremony of taking the 3 refuges, but most people, most Westerners today, don't do this ceremony. And again here, we're going to see something that predates the triune Godhead, okay? These are called the 3 refuges, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So, here are the 3 jewels, or the triune establishment of Buddhism. We have Buddha, the yellow jewel. We have Dharma, the blue jewel, and Sangha, the red jewel. The Buddha refers to both the historical Buddha and the ideal of Buddhahood itself, that which we ascribe to be. The whole Buddhist tradition derives from the historical Buddha and all of the schools of thought that followed. Going to refuge to the Buddha means that you want to follow him. You want to emulate him. Keep in mind now that what we're not going to use is the word worship. The Buddha is not a god. He's not someone to be worshipped. He's someone to be emulated. And this is really the difference between this faith and most other faiths. Because there is no creator God, all that we're doing is following and engaging on the path to enlightenment. The Dharma is the teachings or the way. So when we choose to follow the Dharma, we're saying we're going to follow the teachings of the Buddha. We're going to follow his life example. We're going to use him as the lesson for our own enlightenment. The Buddhists also commit to constant learning and practicing the ways of the Buddha, and they do this by reading the scriptures. The actual canon of Buddhism is several hundred times longer than the Bible itself. So it's a great deal of written information, and if you're interested in learning about it, there's many, many schools of Buddhism that you can follow and learn from. The third jewel is the Sangha, their spiritual community and role models. A follower, someone on the road to enlightenment, needs to recognize that you can't do it yourself. You can't find the way to this small portion of the world without direction, without guidance. And so consequently, we rely on those who have gone before us. We follow the example of the Buddha, but there are so many people in our community who are attempting this path or who have achieved this path or are on the path right now that can help us on our path to enlightenment. And so Buddhism is not an abstract philosophy or creed. It's a way of approaching life. The examples that we get from other people help us on this path to personal growth. Schools of thought, the Buddha taught openly during his lifetime, and so his teachings were propagated both during and after his death. There are more than 18 Buddhist sub-schools of thought right after his death, actually, not too long after. There were several schools of thought, and by the 1st century CE, there were 18 schools of Buddhism, and each one of them is around today for the most part, so you can learn about those schools of Buddhism. They've evolved into many traditions. The more well-known are Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. Most of us know who this guy is, because this is, for most of us, our experience of Buddhism. This is Tibetan Buddhism. This is the Dalai Lama. And so he was forced into exile when China conquered Tibet. Before China conquered Tibet, nearly 1 in 6 men were Buddhist monks in Tibet. There are special features of Tibetan Buddhism: the status of the teacher or the Lama, the focus on the relationship between life and death, the importance of rituals and initiations. It's a much more ritualistic faith than traditional Buddhism. And they practice a great deal of mantras and meditation. So you'll see many of the followers of the Dalai Lama with Tibetan Buddhism involved in chants and involved in sitting for long periods of time with meditation. This is very much an attribute of Tibetan Buddhism. Interestingly, supernatural beings are also prominent in Tibetan Buddhism. There's Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, there's gods and spirits. They're all woven together to form this really interesting, it's difficult to understand, but it's a very interesting faith. The Dalai Lama has lived in exile since 1959. And one of the things that's interesting is we hear about these wonderful phrases from the Dalai Lama, and they're often spread on social media. And this is my favorite one. The Paradox of Man. When asked what surprised him about humanity the most, the Dalai Lama replied, "Man, because he sacrifices his health in order to make money, then he sacrifices money to recuperate his health, and then he's so anxious about the future that he does not enjoy the present, the result being that he does not truly live in the present or the future. He lives as if he is never going to die, and then dies never really having lived." And so I hope that for all of you, the opposite of this is true, that you can engage and enjoy the beauty of life free of suffering, but also when you feel the suffering, to know that this is part of the illusion, and that suffering doesn't exist, pain doesn't exist apart from our perception of it. And that when the Buddha says, when we look back on all of these things, we're just going to laugh when we remember how good life truly is. And with that, I leave you. Thank you all very much for your time and attention.